just making this video to basically vent my frustrations about the lack of consistency from our government. I mean, this is a global issue. Like, you would hear people complain about their governments, to complain about the corruption within their governments, complain about the lying, constant lying, disinformation spread by the government, right? And today I'm only going to be touching on obviously Western governments, but Britain and obviously America to be more specific, right? Because in terms of political significance, Britain and America are basically at the top of that chart. And the global impact that they have when it comes to their foreign policy, when it comes to things like militarism, for example, and obviously their imperial prowess, I think they are more of more significance than a lot of countries. So that's why I'm touching on these two countries. We've all been socially conditioned by the state to believe in this ingrained idea that we need to trust our politicians, that we just need to fundamentally trust our politicians because they know all the answers, right? But our politicians constantly have demonstrated to us, the public, that they lack integrity, that they lack moral values. Obviously, if people have demonstrated to us that they have no integrity about themselves, how can we then believe the things that come from their mouth, right? How can we believe the things that come from their mouths? Literally, how can we vote for somebody who, when asked a question, cannot answer a simple question with a direct answer, right? He would, like take you along in this journey where he would never answer the question that you asked. Politicians never answer the question, and they would just go around throwing figures, some crazy ass numbers, anyways, right? So but the whole point of this introduction is we need to abandon this ingrained idea that our politicians are basically our friend, that the government is our friend, that we need to trust the government because we can't. Honestly, we cannot trust the government. I mean, you could look at the figures when it comes to COVID-19, for example, and how there's so much disinformation and how the public have been misled by the actual figures, the real figures. Like, for example, when somebody died of something, they noted it as like being the cause of their death was the result of COVID, even though it wasn't COVID-19. So obviously that is something that we have to take into account. But I think what's even more important than that is the double standards that we have, right? Obviously, I'm guessing all of you are aware of the invasion or the current conflict in Gaza, where Israel, the state of Israel, has basically set an occupation, has occupied the place of Gaza or the Palestine for 70 years, right? This place has been under occupation, right? And we could remember vividly, right, when Russia invaded Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, our governments were in total condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, totally against it, right? So it's so weird how you can have the same situation with a similar political context or implication, except that in this particular scenario, it's actually worse because children are getting killed, women are getting killed. About 70% of the population, or 50% of the population, are children, and 70% of people that have been murdered were women and children by Israel. And the British government is still siding with the state of Israel. So how can we then trust the government when they can't demonstrate to us that they've got something as simple as integrity, something as simple as being honest to the public? How can we trust them? How can we trust our own government if they keep lying to us constantly? Gaza or Palestine has been under occupation for 70 years. Right? If you look at the map before 1948, there was no Israel before 1948. Israel was an idea that was imagined and created by the British obviously invasion after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But the whole concept of Israel had existed like way back in the day. So like in 1917, for example, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour was his name at the time, so he was the Foreign Secretary under David Lloyd George. He wrote a letter which was known as the Balfour Declaration, promising land for Jewish people in that area. But the weird thing is, how can you promise land to people, a land that doesn't belong to you? It belongs to Palestinians, it belongs to Arabs, but he just promised the land to them, right? Which is absolutely like ridiculous and crazy that they would do this. But these are like the implications, global geopolitical implications of colonialism. So if we got these double standards, right, we've got the British government in total condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but in complete support of Israel's invasion of Gaza. What does that tell us? There's a global system of white supremacy where white countries, they tend to be more powerful militarily, would basically side with one another. So have you seen how the British government, the American government, and all the European countries are basically, I'm not the people, but I'm talking about their governments, are siding with Israel. Although the vast majority of people aren't siding with Israel, but their governments are siding with Israel. It's the same thing during apartheid in South Africa, where all the Western political powers or Western governments were siding with the apartheid government. But today, a lot of them can look back retrospectively, and all of us can agree that the apartheid government was racist. But back in the day, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, all of these people were in total support of the apartheid government. Can you believe it? So there's this lack of morality within our politicians. Like there's just, they don't have any integrity or backbone to themselves. And obviously the constant lies is just ridiculous. And you've got obviously the biggest supporters, or the biggest meat riders, should I say, the biggest meat riders of the state of Israel. Joe Biden is obviously the current president of the United States of America. Not a very nice person. And obviously America's having an election soon. And he's going against POTUS 45, former President Donald Trump, who's obviously running again. Right? And Biden, in my opinion at least, is going to be losing a lot of support, largely or primarily because of his support for Israel's occupation of Gaza, and the fact that he's not really condemned the deaths of 30,000 Palestinians, in which 70% of those people killed were women and children. And not only that, but the American government is constantly sending weapons to the state of Israel. So obviously the Muslim Americans are not going to vote for him because of that. In addition to that, the vast majority of African Americans have turned their backs against Joe Biden because most African Americans can understand the systems of oppression. So they obviously would not vote for Joe Biden. So a lot of them are pro-Palestine over Israel, right? So he's in deep trouble, and this election coming, I think he's definitely not going to win that election, to be honest. He's not very popular at the moment, but we'll see what's going to materialize. And then you've got the one that pisses me off the most, which is the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. Me, just like the vast majority of younger people in this country, most of us are more inclined to want to vote for the Labour Party because obviously the Labour Party's policies and rhetoric appeals to younger people more than the Tories. So I'm more inclined to want to vote for the Labour Party. Now, I would have voted for the Labour Party if their leader was Jeremy Corbyn or anyone else. But the current leader, Keir Starmer, has no backbone again, has no integrity about himself. Like, he supports Israel because it's basically the politically popular thing to do. Support Israel, literally, because it's the popular thing to do. It's not about his morality or integrity or anything like that. He's doing it because America's doing it, because Germany's doing it, because France is doing it, because all these Western white countries are doing it. Right? So he's obviously not, never ever going to get my vote, right? Because again, for me personally and many young people, and you watching right now, integrity and honesty matters to you, right? It matters to me, it matters to you. And if he, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, cannot demonstrate based something as simple as honesty and integrity about himself, then obviously I'm not going to vote for him. And obviously we've got the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's probably the biggest clown I've ever seen in my life. You've got a guy who nobody has voted for in this country. Nobody has voted for. He was elected by his own staff, by his own colleagues, basically. And he's making crucial decisions, right? Passing laws, like just recently passed the Rwanda bill, which is what this bill is going to do, or this law is basically going to grab people who have come to this country as refugees and send them to a country like Rwanda, a country that's obviously not safe, right? A country that has a long history of violence, literally. Right? I'm pretty sure you've heard of the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where one tribe called the Hutus or the Tutsis murdered the other minority tribe, basically. And it was the biggest form of genocide we've ever seen in history, right? Obviously, alongside what's going on in Gaza, where people, Palestinians, are getting slaughtered left, right, and center. Absolutely disgusting. And our politicians are in complete support of this, right? So how can we live in a country where someone like Rishi Sunak is not voted in by the public? Nobody voted for that guy. But guess what? He's the Prime Minister. He's making crucial decisions. He's banning stuff. He's putting in bills that nobody cares about. He's putting in bills that might obviously have a devastating consequences on the lives of people. For example, the Rwanda bill that I've mentioned. And it's just, and people just accept it. People just accept it. I'm like, what is going on? What is wrong with us? Why do we have to accept these things? Right, the social, the economic, and the political implications of these things are fundamentally devastating. And I think the British public or the British people, we have to push back a little bit more. Like, look at France, for example. A while back, they raised the age of retirement, and French people weren't having it. They came out to the streets and showed the government who they really fucking are, right? But I feel like the British people are just a little bit more laid back, and we're more willing to accept anything that comes by, which I think is a very naive way of living, to be honest. A very naive way of living. I genuinely do believe that when it comes to these double standards that we have, like these double standards of like, oh, allow Ukrainian refugees to come to this country, but when it comes to Palestinian refugees, for example, or when it comes to refugees from Gaza and from Afghanistan, for example, our governments are less inclined to want to let these people in. I bet you vividly remember when the Taliban finally took over Afghanistan. We've literally had no support. We've provided no support for people in Afghanistan. Zero. Even though Britain have played such a significant role in that war, right? In not facilitating that war, but also maintaining the war and making sure that the war continued. People in Afghanistan fought alongside the British people, but the British people turned their backs against them. Same with America, right? But when Russia invaded Ukraine, all you heard was, oh, the government was like actually encouraging the British public to let in refugees to this country, right? Literally, you can't read Ukrainian refugees, right? It's like, oh yeah, allow them to this country. You know what? Not only allow them to this country, but we should welcome them to our houses. So why do you think that is? Why is it that we didn't have the same level of support? The same level of support towards refugees from Afghanistan or people from Palestine, for example, or people from black and brown countries, but we're more than willing to let white refugees from Ukraine. Again, it goes back to race. Britain doesn't have any due diligence in having a desire to want to help Ukraine. Britain is doing it because, again, it's a political thing. But like when it comes to the refugees, the reason why Britain is more enthusiastic in wanting to help Ukrainian refugees, again, it goes back to race. And it's largely because Ukrainian refugees are white and refugees from Palestine or Afghanistan are not white, right? So that's what I mean when I talk about there's an interconnected global system of white supremacy that white people globally benefit from. And an example would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fact that our government wants Ukrainians to come to this country, but not only to come to this country, but also to come to our houses. So we should welcome them. But there isn't that same intent or desire when it comes to refugees from Afghanistan or Palestine. So that's that racial context to it, to be honest, that we all have to fundamentally acknowledge that, we have governments that are absolutely fucking racist, right? If we're not willing to acknowledge these things, it's just bad, because what's going to end up happening is we would push the race conversation aside and start talking about things like gender inequality and feminism, and the government is going to use that as a way of getting votes. But like, the racial conversation is just something that is kind of brushed under the rug, right? But again, if our politicians are racist, we have to point it out. And it don't matter whether the politicians are Labour or Conservative, right? At the end of the day, if they espouse racist policies that might maybe benefit people from a white country, at the same time simultaneously disadvantaging people from a black and brown country, we have to acknowledge these things, right? We have to acknowledge these devastating foreign policies from our governments, right, against black and brown people. Right? I've mentioned how, for example, the British government was in support of the apartheid government in South Africa. Right? The British government were in support of it. The British government labeled, same with America, labeled Nelson Mandela as being a terrorist until the end of apartheid. And America labeled him as being a terrorist since 2008. He was labeled as a terrorist. But we all can look back retrospectively and agree that it is absolutely ridiculous or egregious to label Nelson Mandela as being a terrorist. Nelson Mandela is literally the greatest freedom fighter you've ever seen in your life, or you would ever see in your life. He spent 27 years in prison. 27 years in prison for fighting for what he believed in. Freedom. Right? So obviously he's not a terrorist, right? So we have to acknowledge these things too. And finally, our position is fundamentally important in this conflict in Gaza, but also how we perceive and how we view our politicians, right? And I want you to basically, come to terms with this fact that we live in a society where we've been socially ingrained and politically conditioned to believe that our politicians are everything. Everything that comes from the government is the fundamental truth. That if it comes from the government, we just have to accept it as being the truth. But that's also our biggest downfall, to be honest. It's our biggest downfall. This idea that the government is here for us. Our governments are full of liars. The biggest scumbags you would ever see in your life. Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Joe Biden in America. Literally every single one of them. Except, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn. He's the man with integrity. He's the man that this country needs. So, obviously, our politicians have no backbone. Morals and values are not guided by what's right, but it's mostly primarily guided by what's popular at the moment. And in terms of global politics, what's popular with these politicians is to side with Israel, right? It seems like that's the right thing to do for them, which is not obviously the right thing to do, right? But I think that's what they believe, right? And obviously the fact that lying has become a tolerable trait from our politicians. It's almost become an acceptable trait for our politicians to just lie to us, right? Just constantly lying about the economy, inflation, interest rates, and obviously the housing crisis, COVID-19 figures. We've got enough of these people. How can we vote all these motherfuckers out? And we've got stupid MPs, stupid members of parliament who can't even represent their own constituents. Like literally, like you would send an email to an MP, right? It takes like 3 weeks before you get a response. Sometimes you don't even get a response at all, which is just absolutely shocking, mate. So I just want to understand your perspective on what's going on, the lack of moral consistency from our politicians. I just want to understand your perspective. And what can we do as people to basically end this bullshit, right? Could we vote them out? What's the solution? Because our politicians have obviously clearly exemplified what corruption really is. And they'd be the biggest first people to point out corruption in other countries, except that we've got corruption so rife within our governments in this country. It's embarrassing. Smash the like button down below. Make sure you comment as well and subscribe with obviously your notification bells on, and I'll see you later. Peace.